Welcome. We're here for the latest in our oral history series. I'm Bill Case. I'm here with John Clark, who's our videographer, and we're pleased to welcome Jeff McNealey, my cohort on the German Village Society Board of Trustees. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to do this, to share my memories of German Village over the last 50 years or so. And what do you want to know?
Well, let's start from the start. Jeff, you grew up in the Columbus area.
Grew up in the Columbus area out in Blacklick. Now, Blacklick at that time was way out in the country. Mother used to take me and my sister downtown to Lazarus. That was the big trip on a Saturday morning. She'd drive down with gloves, the only appropriate way to go to Lazarus, I imagine. But I was never allowed to go south of Hall's Hardware on High Street.
And why was that?
Bad things happened south of that, particularly down in that German Village area, which was a little bit seedy back in the 50s. It was going through, as I now know, a lot of change, a lot of transition as people fled the village, going to the suburbs with the advent of the highways.
But the first time you were seeing the area was pre the interstate.
Pre the interstate, Central Market was still a viable central market as opposed to being a bus station as it is now. Occasionally I'd get glimpses of it, but it probably wasn't until I was in law school up at Ohio State that I actually began to experience and to appreciate more greatly what was going on down here.
And that would be what time period?
Graduated from law school in 1969.
But at that time you were living on campus, I assume?
Up by campus, yes.
And then in '69, what happened?
'69, I came out of law school and took a job in a law firm downtown. Been there ever since, and made a lot of friends in law school, some of whom were young families starting out, buying some of the houses down here in the '70s, early '70s, both to rehab and to establish a rather bohemian way of life at that point in time.
Did you think that might be a good idea for you?
I discussed it with my wife at the time. We were living in Bexley. She sort of wanted to be in the country, and I said, that's fine. How about a pied-à-terre down in German Village? No, that wouldn't work. Ultimately, we got divorced, but nevertheless, we both had an appreciation for what was going on down here.
There was a time when you did come down here.
I would come down here periodically to visit various of the friends that we had. Most of them were in their mid-20s or so. All of them were looking at restoring houses. Interestingly, restoration was going on, indeed, as it has continued up to today. Some of the older houses probably have been restored 2, 3, 4 times over the last 30 years. The exterior, however, have always remained the same, which has set a classic tone for the village. The earlier restorations generally took place after 5 in the evening and on weekends. That's when you heard saws and hammers. Quite a bit has changed now. Now it's done generally by professional carpenters.
When did you move down to German Village?
First moved down here in 1986, but I'd had rather extensive involvement because of those early friends down here, and in doing that represented them in one of their lawsuits, and also got involved with the formation of the German Village Foundation around 1980.
Did the litigation that you were involved in have anything to do with society matters or the village itself?
At that time, many of the original founders of the society were still the major leaders of the German Village Society. There was an ambivalence of the society members at that time, not nearly as well organized as it is now, on the residential-commercial balance. Max and Irma's was attempting to expand throughout their building. At that time, the original Max and Irma, Wisconsin, had the bar downstairs, which had been on the first floor, which it had been for probably decades. A wonderful watering hole. Barry Zaks bought it out from Max and Irma's and did a wonderful restoration job, but he wanted to expand into the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors. The 4th floor, as I understand it, although I was never there, has a ballroom, a stage, and an assembly area that was used by the fraternal order that originally owned that building. He wanted to expand to all 4 floors. You can imagine the increase in traffic and parking pressures, noise, everything else that would have been occasioned by that, and we challenged the granting of a variance. Ultimately, the expansion never went forward.
You also were involved in the foundation activities even before you came down.
Absolutely.
Tell us about
because of the involvement representing some of the villagers. Now, it wasn't the society, it was a private group of villagers who organized for that sole purpose. They felt it important that monies be received on a long-term basis, set aside through a foundation, which we established at the Columbus Foundation, to fund preservation efforts down here. They recognized that without solid financial backing, there probably would not be as firm historic preservation as could be the case with financial backing. So the foundation was set up for that purpose.
For those who may see this interview years from now and don't know exactly what the foundation was vis-a-vis the society, tell us about that.
The foundation was formed as a separate entity from the society. There was a tension within the community and the society members itself on what the role of the society was. Many of the older members of the village were then feeling that they wanted to give to a fund that would be forever protected for the single purpose of fostering historic preservation. That indeed was done probably circa 1980, maybe 1981.
And then what happened to the foundation?
We felt over the next 5 or 6 years that there would be a good flow of money. And indeed, there was flow of money, most of it by way of bequests. So you never knew exactly when the funds were going to be donated. But we felt that the foundation was a worthwhile anchor for historic preservation. A lot of confusion arose, however, between the villagers as to the role of the foundation versus the society versus the commission. And indeed, that tension between the commission and the society, who is responsible for what, continues today. To reduce that level of contention, the foundation being a 501c3, and at that point the society was not formally registered as a 501c3, the decision was to reduce the tension by merging the foundation and the society together, keeping in mind that each had their own separate boards of directors.
I know that you, in your other civic activities, you've had an interest in safeguarding financial resources. Tell us about that.
For whatever reasons, I, both in my church and here in the village and for other charitable institutions, have wound up overseeing various other foundations. Money set aside for specific purpose. It's something that you do that others within each of those organizations would come on as the trustees overseeing that. It's in rising markets, it's not particularly challenging. Falling markets, you always have the concern because you have to continue the beneficial purposes for which the fund was set up. Sometimes you may or may not have as much money as you would like. Hence the foundation set up conservatively to put out a limited amount of cash so that hopefully year over year, long term, there would be sufficient monies to fund at some level whatever the activities were that the foundation was set up for.
Your law career with Porter Wright also had some further intersections with German Village activities, did it not?
It did. I've had an environmental practice on a national basis, a real estate development practice more on a local basis. So in that real estate development practice, I've become more aligned with harmonizing views of different people on how areas ought to develop or ought not to develop. That expertise I was able to bring into my role here in German Village.
How did that work?
Well, the first was that Max and Irma's appeal going forward. But through conflict resolution and land use decisions, bringing all the people together, has proven to be a good way to solve some of these problems. Perhaps not to everybody's satisfaction, but to at least a level that there's no explosions within whatever the territory has been. We've had near explosions here in German Village over the years, and generally it is a tension between what is and what might be because of changing goals of new people coming in, tensions between the residential balance with the commercial balance. All of those, I think, are a very healthy tension. It helps people focus on the why and the wherefore for German Village, how we live, how we want to live together in community down here.
One example of where you were retained in a matter of that sort involving change was Schumacher Place.
I was retained by some of the the original founders of the German Village Society. I'm going to say probably in the late 1970s. Schumacher Place, the area immediately adjacent to German Village to the east, had asked that City Council amend the ordinance defining German Village to include that. When German Village was originally defined by city ordinance, a lot of research went in to analyzing the historic architectural types, the way the streets were laid out, how people related one to another, and they drew very specific boundaries. Easy boundary on the west is Pearl. On the east side, it moves in and out through a series of alleys, goes around the Giant Eagle, which was originally a playing field that Ohio State played on in the 1880s. But in drawing those lines, they were specific to set a very high criteria for consistency within the village of architectural styles. It was felt by these original German Village founders that Schumacher Place just didn't meet that, and ultimately City Council declined to amend the boundaries.
Why did the proponents want to do it?
The proponents wanted to do it to gain the protection of the Historic Preservation Ordinance, to make sure that whatever changes were going to occur in that area would occur in a manner sympathetic to the existing neighborhood and not in radical change to the historic styles that were there.
In the end, was it a good thing that Schumacher Place did not become part of the German Village Historic District?
I can't opine on that specific question, but Schumacher Place, as in the case of Marion Village to the south, have had remarkable success both by peer pressure and by monitoring the economic success of restoration harmonic with the historic neighborhoods. They've grown stronger. They've been restored well. They're coming up to the levels of German Village. And particularly for Marion Village to the south, in recent years, the rate of real estate valuation has increased at a higher rate than the rate here in German Village itself. So, ordinance or no ordinance, clearly the effort of those two villages, those two areas of Columbus, have been successful.
You moved down here in 1986.
Moved down here in 1986, west of Lindy's on Beck Street.
Where you still reside?
No.
That was, now you're east.
Now we leave. My wife and I moved east of Beck Street. Very happily, it's still a short walk or crawl to Lindy's.
When did you and Sarah get married?
Sarah and I were married in 1988, 2 years after I moved down here.
She also has been very active in the village.
She's been very active. She's more of a gardener person than I am. I'm allowed to take dead things out, but I would never be one to put in new things. She has been very active in the community, working with Parks and Public Spaces now as the chairman of that committee for several years.
So when you moved down here, first of all, why did you move down?
At that time, I was living in Bexley and needed a major psychological change commensurate with the divorce. Found a double west of Lindy's, bought it, size for size. The double was about the size of my living room in Bexley, but the sense of community was far stronger down here than it was in community, and indeed many of the old-timers who knew me welcomed me, and I was asked to go on the German Village Society board as soon as I was a resident down here.
Tell us about some of those old timers that you recall.
Some of them were actually born in the houses they still lived in. Most of them were all South Siders. I learned very early that it was not the South End. Some over on Parsons would say it's the South Beginning, but it is clearly the South Side. Established back in the 1830s by German residents, and indeed many of the citizens or the residents down here still spoke German, or at least understood it.
Do you remember a few of them?
Well, I'd have to go back through my memories to remember them. I can picture a lot of them.
They welcomed you.
But they were very welcoming, they were very embracing, and that was one of the warmths of the neighborhood down here, of the community spirit. And on Saturday mornings, you could hear German spoken in various of the areas, particularly up at Jurgens on 4th and Jackson.
So here you are, you get elected to the, I don't know if it was then an elected post, but you become a board member in 1988.
I filled a vacancy originally, and then was immediately elected in '88, and stayed on the board for that term for 21, 22 years.
As you look back, and you're on the board again here as we speak in 2014, how did the society and its board differ in the way they did things then and now?
A lot of changes, a lot of growth over the 30-plus years that I've been involved with the society on a more official basis. Originally, we had a structure that was given to us down on Lozelle and Frank Columbus that was then purchased and redeveloped into a large house, multi-structural house, which enabled us then to use those funds to buy where we are now, here in the meeting house.
It was a controversial decision at the time, though, wasn't it?
It was a controversial decision. It was giving up an old building that needed an awful lot of work for that portion of that structure was probably 1850 to 1860. For coming into this building, our current meeting house, which had been a lodge building prior to the time it had been taken over by an advertising agency. What is now the visitor center actually was their large truck garage, and what is now the fest hall upstairs had been the area they laid out all their canvases to actually paint billboard canvas. An interesting layout in here, but that business gave up. We had the opportunity to buy it, and with the sale of the other building coming to this building, it worked out quite well.
And you were on the board when that decision was made, I think.
Was on the board at that time.
So what activities did you get into as a member of the society board at the outset?
As the activities were at that time, we always had the house and garden tour. I would be frequently a tour director on the trams that carried all of our visitors throughout the park, which was great time meeting and greeting, sharing with them my memories of the area. Always successful, not nearly as successful as it is now, but we had as our major fundraiser the German Village Oktoberfest, which had been run by the Schmidts up at the fairgrounds, and then we brought it back down to the village as a society-sponsored event, probably in '85, '86, sometime in that time frame.
And that was a major fundraiser for the society for many years.
It was our major fundraiser and friend-raiser. In the last years of the Oktoberfest, we averaged about $125,000 profit that underwrote a major portion of the activities of the society. But more importantly at that time, it fostered a very strong connection with the downtown businesses who used volunteer opportunities at the Oktoberfest as a means for building the personnel morale within their own groups. Bank One particularly was a heavy sponsor with volunteers, and depending on what was going on politically, we always had campaigns, each with their own special t-shirts for all of their volunteers, coming in and volunteering, particularly to run the beer wagons.
Nevertheless, there came a time when the society gave up running the Oktoberfest.
There was a decision by the then board members to give up. A lot of dissatisfaction, dissension at the board at that time. They had been advised by some of us longer term folks in the community that if they gave it up, they would lose it forever. That thought was not shared by the majority of the board at that time. They gave it up thinking they would pick it up again a year afterwards. Within 5 or 6 days after the decision was made, Schmitz picked it up, and within 5 or 6 weeks staged the Oktoberfest again at the fairgrounds, where it is now very successful.
So you were on the board from '88 for how long the first time?
Actually from '86, 20 years nominally, mid-2000s.
Tell us, if you can just kind of remember generally some of the interesting issues that came up during that first go-round.
At the first go-around, we had no professional staff. We recognized that we needed to have staff. We also needed to have some major improvements made to this building. About '87 or so, we started talking about a major capital campaign. All of these activities would not have happened without the foresight of Fred Holdridge. Fred and some of the original folks, although Fred was not an original founder, he and Howard moved down here, I think, in about 1970-71. But they became the heartbeat of the village. And they organized a lot of support for the thought of a capital campaign. A committee was structured. We did background investigations and using Gettler and Associates, and ultimately launched the campaign publicly in about 1990. Now, we had done a lot of pre-campaign work, so we had a large portion of the ultimate $1.1 million raised already committed. We also, at that time, when city budgets were far better than they are now, had an agreement by the city for public improvements to Schiller Park. They would be matched 2 to 1. So we raised money on that matching basis to completely redo the amphitheater, the pond, the tennis courts, and create the Huntington Gardens, the esplanade leading up to the Schiller statue. Also restored the Schiller statue, put in more lights, benches throughout the park, and then raised enough money to redo the meeting house to roughly the same condition it is now.
So the campaign had the happy consequence of not only raising money internally, but also obtaining additional funds from the city.
Yes, fortunately, Parks and Recreation and the City Council at large recognized the significance of German Village and the need for improving these older parts of town, which increasingly were raising an economic value and certainly were raising potential long-term leaders who were resident and would be supportive of the downtown community.
Jeff, tell us a little more about the role you played in that effort.
I was one of the leaders of that capital campaign drive. Asked a lot of people for a lot of money, and fortunately the group of us who were doing that were very successful.
You mentioned Parks and Rec stepped up. You've had some very extensive involvement with the city parks as well.
As a part of my real estate development practice, I worked extensively with Columbus Recreation and Parks, Maureen Lorenz particularly, and Alan McKnight. Alan is now the director. Out of that experience, I gained a very strong appreciation for parks, not only as places for rest, but also the economic growth that they can spur in the neighborhoods around those parks. Over the years, particularly now through my involvement with the Urban Land Institute, I've become more of an advocate for parks in general. I now am an appointed member of the Franklin County and Columbus Metro Park System, and also a commissioner of the Columbus Recreation and Parks Commission.
You mentioned Fred Holdridge of the great team of Fred and Howard. Tell me a little bit more about your recollections of those two folks.
Fred and Howard had a rather eclectic background, coming to Columbus for reasons I'm not quite sure of at this point, living on Sunbury Road north of what is now Ohio Dominican. At some point, always interested in the arts and perhaps a little bohemian, decided to come down and buy House Frau Haven, or what is now known as House Frau Haven, and live in one of the 3 apartments above the commercial part. They came down, immediately embraced the village, became leaders, extremely well loved and well respected for their dedication to the village. In terms of their eclectic tastes, House Frau Haven had soup to nuts and everything else that you could never imagine you needed until you needed it. And then you went there and they had it. I remember early in my living down here that we were going to have a picnic with my children out in the park. It rained. And I said, well, we need a red checkered tablecloth and we need some ants. So I went down to House Frau Haven. Getting the tablecloth was pretty easy, but lo and behold, under the counter, Fred also had bags of plastic ants, which sprinkled there. They were the life of the arts. They were the life of the fun of the village. It's a great loss to not have them here.
They were community activists too.
Oh, far more than activists. They played the trombones, the trumpets, beat the drums, all over. There was nobody in Columbus, particularly downtown and in City Hall, that did not know and generally respect Fred and Howard.
You came back to the board a second time more recently.
Came back. I was troubled with the direction of the board at that time, and along with Bill Curlis, who had not been recruited for re-election, we decided we probably ought to at least put our hats in the ring and see what the community thought about bringing us back in, which in the election, indeed, we were re-elected.
Sitting here now in 2014, tell us what you think of the direction of the society and where it's going.
We've always had tension of ideas, but generally respect among the commissioner or among the board members. We've had also strong executive leadership. An entity such as this needs strong leadership. It cannot be volunteer driven. It needs leadership to lead the volunteers where things need to go for the benefit of the order. There was, during my time off the board, a loss of some of that focus, loss of some of the historic perspective, and clearly a loss of the executive leadership. Fortunately, that now has been very effectively reversed with Shiloh coming on board. Indeed, 2 days ago, prior to this interview, we had a very effective retreat of all of the board members, all being important. It was the first time in some number of years that 100% of the board members participated. It was a good time, an open dialogue. Yes, tension's always there, but we resolved, worked through, and I think amicably will go forward to strengthen the village, strengthen the society.
And I might note that today, January 13th, is the first day of our new historic preservationist employment, Sarah Marson, and that marks another big event in our history.
Fortunately, the society members in general have recognized the growing strength and are renewing their financial commitment, which is enabling us to increase the staff up to where it had been 10, 15 years ago.
Going forward, what do you think are the challenges for the society?
We'll always have the dynamic challenge of commercial versus residential balance. Indeed, the historic prototype for a village like this is drawn from Germany, where there always was a mixture of local service commercial serving the individual residents on a pedestrian basis. It is not a automobile-oriented community here, although many of us drive to work and drive to the shopping centers and everything else. It is very much pedestrian-oriented. There'll be that tension between commercial-residential balance, but we're also seeing a tension between suburbanites now wanting to come to German Village and bringing with them some of their suburban memories oriented more toward motor vehicles. That has related to pressures on parking on the streets, and probably some architectural shifts toward more people building or squeezing in garages. That tension will be there. It becomes an educational effort for the society to acquaint new residents with what we're about in a pedestrian mode. There will be some effort for different types of mass transit down here in the near future, a streetcar line. That will, of necessity, bring change in the physical structure of the streets that it is on, but hopefully will also refocus people on the need not to have a car, to get back and forth downtown into some of the larger commercial enterprises without having to drive, walk a distance, and have a good ride, relaxing ride, back and forth.
Two of the roles you have currently in your service on the board, Jeff, are the board's attorney and also a strong member of the finance committee. What are, particularly on the finance committee, what are the challenges going forward in that?
Looking at the law element of now, fortunately there's not many legal problems or issues that need to be addressed. The finance issue, however, is one of the key. Back even in the early 80s and underlying the creation of the foundation was a concern over the profligacy of the German Village Society board. Back in that time there were thoughts that all they were was a party organization. And indeed there was an awful lot of box wine floating around at that time. Times have shifted. We've moved from boxed wine in German Village now to real bottles, screw caps, but real bottles. Maintaining transparency and a tight rein on the finances is a critical role for any of the charitable organizations, critical for them to be successful, both by way of planning to meet their mission and by gaining support from their donors for the dollars that it takes to meet the vision. Fortunately, I've been able, with a very strong group of people on the finance committee, to, I think, effectively improve things, both budgetary and cash management, giving the reports to the board so they can balance in their vision, meeting the goals of the society with the resources available.
Jeff, tell me what living in and serving in German Village has meant to you.
I grew up in Blacklick. As a youngster, ran the fields barefoot as one of the wildest Indians, horseback riding on the neighbors' horses, being out with the cattle, working in the barns. It was not particularly communal except for the handful of friends that were out there. As I have grown over the years, I've grown to appreciate far more a community life, both for its vibrancy and for what it can help me grow into. In doing that, coming out of Bexley, which was one lifestyle, into German Village, created or opened a whole new type of community for me. And indeed, Sarah shares very much in that. In doing everything that we do, there is a lot of positive feedback from people in the village, from friends who come from outside to see how well the village is done, and it creates a pride point for living in the village and trying to help it both maintain where it was and to meet modern needs within the confines of historic preservation. That's been rewarding, particularly as an adjunct to my real estate development practice.
Jeff, thank you for your service to German Village, and we know there'll be lots more to come. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.